Good afternoon. You're tuned into Story Club FM, and you're with me, Wanga, bringing you the program Art History. And like I always say, the earth without art is just eh. So let's talk about art. But before we do that, let's listen to the song So What by Miles Davis. is a very interesting genre of music. A lot of people associate jazz with hotel lobbies or just places where there's very peaceful energy, very calm energy. But jazz has a very long history. It has a history that ties in with liberation of people. It has a history that ties in with rebellion. It has history that ties in with just joy. It started in the early 1900s. That's where most music historians will trace jazz, and this was in New Orleans, where musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver, and Louis Armstrong borrowed heavily from ragtime, blues, and second line horn sections from parades. Even New Orleans funeral music inspired early jazz musicians. Southern jazz from New Orleans eventually became a known Dixieland jazz. It became known as Dixieland jazz. Jazz has different types of jazz. There's Afro jazz, there is modern time jazz. When you think of jazz, you think of different types of jazz, and in most cases, some people will think of jazz by thinking of music from back in the day. But we also have our own modern time jazz artists. We have Mandis Jantis from South Africa. We have Masigo from America. There's artists that are still making music that is inspired by jazz and is jazz music, just not making it the same way that it was made back then. Jazz music is not quick. It's not the 2 minute songs that we get all the time. Jazz tends to go on for long. They play different instruments like the saxophone, piano, flute. They play a lot of wind instruments in jazz and piano. So jazz music involves instruments that are not as, I don't know what the right word would be, but it also involves drums. It involves trumpet. Trumpet is a very big instrument in jazz, and it's something that adds to what jazz should be. In the early 1920s and 30s, other early jazz capitals included Chicago, Kansas City, but it was New York City that established jazz as a touchstone of American culture. Big bands led by band leaders like Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson performed for nightclub audiences. Ellington in particular was famous for his original compositions, which drew from classical music and highlighted soloists within the Ellington Big Band. These artists made themselves well known because of what they did. It was during a time where music was growing. It was becoming its own thing, and jazz branched off from what could have been classical music, but they added a touch to it that made it more upbeat. Classical music back then was the peaceful violin and the peaceful flute, but jazz added something different to it. It had all that peace, but it had a lot more movement as well. It was played in nightclubs, which is something interesting to think of for our generation, for people in these times to say you go to a nightclub, you're expecting music that's not jazz. But jazz at its inception was something that was played in nightclubs. It was something that was upbeat, something that could get people to move, people to dance, people to party. It was party music. And when you think of party music, now we don't think of jazz. And it's the same thing with even our modern day jazz artists. When they play their music, it's not the kind of music that you would assume you would find at a nightclub, or you might find it at a bar, but definitely not a nightclub where people are dancing. At nightclubs, we have things like Afrobeat, which also have certain traces of jazz and as an influence to them, because Afrobeat was influenced by Fela Kuti, and Fela Kuti had a lot of jazz influences in his music. As an artist in general, he paid homage to jazz in the way he played his music. There's songs like Zombie, for example. When you hear the song Zombie, it has a lot of wind instruments, instruments such as the trumpet, instruments like the saxophone. It has instruments that give a jazz feel. And as jazz was growing as a genre, it also was a genre that took certain instruments and identified with them. A saxophone, a trumpet, those two, and a piano. Those instruments are instruments that when you see, you are likely to associate them with jazz. And the movement did not only just happen as a change to music, but it also became an adoption and a change to instruments as well. It gave these different music instruments character. It allowed these instruments to have a mind of their own and just travel to different things and diversify themselves. A saxophone is something that's very jazzy, but you can also add it to a good hip hop beat. And hip hop also uses influences of jazz. Jazz has been like a foundation for modern day music. It's the building block. There's songs like Blue Notes by Mick Mill, where the beginning of the song, the intro of the song, is a beautiful jazz song. It plays the saxophone in a very beautiful jazzy tone, and then it immediately jumps into a rap verse immediately after that. It shows that jazz over the years has not lost its influence but has grown, and jazz has become a genre that is associated with class. It's a genre that's associated with something that's not basic, something that's not just easy. It's something that is elegant, and it can be seen in how rounded the notes that come from jazz music are. Before we carry on, let's listen to the song.
Busted flat in Baton Rouge, waiting for a train, and I was feeling near as faded as my jeans. Bobby thumbed a diesel down just before it rained and rode us all the way to New Orleans. I pulled my harpoon out of my dirty red bandana. I was playing soft while Bobby sang the blues. Windshield wipers slapping time, I was holding Bobby's hand in mine. We sang every song that Javi knew. Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing, I mean nothing, honey, if it ain't free. No, no. Yeah, feeling good was easy, love, when he sang the blues. You know, feeling good was good enough for me. Good enough for me and my Bobby, yeah. From the Kentucky coal mine to the California sun, hey, Bobby shared the secrets of my soul. Through all kinds of weather, through everything that we've done, yeah, Bobby, baby, kept me from the whole world. One day up near Salinas, long, I let him slip away. He's looking for that home, and I hope he finds it. But I trade all of my tomorrows for one single yesterday, to be holding Bobby's body next to mine. Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing, that's all that Bobby left me. But if feeling good was easy, loud when he sang the blues, hey, feeling good was good enough for me. Good enough for me and my Bobby, yeah. La da da, la da da da, la da da, la da da da, la da da, la da Bobby, yeah. La da da la da, la da da da, la da la Bobby, yeah. La da da. Ain't nobody
hope you enjoyed that song by Janis Joplin, and it's called Me and Bobby McGee. Certain music that can be seen as jazz is not always classified under jazz. In the 1920s, 1940s, it was Joplin used to perform her music and rose to fame in the late 1940s. Late 1940s. She was born in 1940s. That's when she grew up, and that's to say that she had been born after jazz had already established its influence, but her music also had jazz as an influence. Even though her music is usually identified as rock, it's also music that have all these influences from jazz. It has all these instruments, all this upbeat type of music. It's classified as blues, which also falls under the definition of jazz. She was active from 1962 to 1970, and in 1970 she died from a heroin overdose, which is something that during the era of jazz from the 1920s leading up to the 1970s and beyond that, jazz artists were artists that were known for being party artists. They were out there. They were artists that were found in different places and different nightclubs, and thus had different influences on them. Some of them felt these influences and were not able to maintain their careers outside of their addictions, and some of them maintained careers within these addictions, and these addictions could even be credited for giving them what could have been the spark or the inspiration for their music. And a lot of arts in the 19 between the 1940s and 1950s, New York musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Bad Powell, Art Blakey developed a jazz subgenre called bebop. The style of music involved lightning, fast playing, prolific soloing over chord changes and routine syncopation. Musicians like Ornette Coleman and the Modern Jazz Quartet challenged the harmonic rules of traditional jazz. Coleman, in particular, is credited with creating a genre called free jazz that largely disposed of the song form that guides most jazz standards. It's a type of jazz that allows people to not have just what the music notes were, not the traditional jazz where everything is nice and set up in a line, but it allows the soloist to just break off from what the song is and just go and get lost in the music, which happens a lot. It's a lot. The instrument that is used the most for these solos is a saxophone and a piano, where the artist will just get lost and just keep playing completely different to what the song was, and just let themselves have a solo, let themselves have a moment where they are one with the music. And in post bebop 1960s, the tempo of jazz was slowed down and it added a harmonic sophistication. Musicians of different walks of life like Miles Davis or Charles Mingus cut their teeth in bebop but became better known in their post-bop compositions. Davis developed a genre called cool jazz, which is something that is usually related to jazz. When you say cool jazz, it sounds accurate. It sounds like that's exactly what jazz should be, something that is cool and calm. And even post-tonal improvisations like Coltrane Ascension's album. Meanwhile, musicians like Herbie Hancock and Joe Zinwell merged jazz with funk and rock to create a new genre known as fusion. Others created Others found inspiration in folk music and added that genre to their jazz performances. Fusion was different types of jazz, and when you hear a modern day type of music, it sounds like fusion is what now gave birth to what we have now. It was different types of music merging, and during this time when jazz was growing, other genres of music were growing as well. Other genres were finding their footing in society, finding their footing in their art to see what exactly they want their sound to be. And this gave the artists a lot of freeway to a lot of leeway, sorry, to add different types of songs, to merge different types of sounds and just experiment and create a whole new thing, which is what we now know as jazz. It had to grow from different levels of what jazz should be, different levels of what music should really look like. These artists had the opportunity to create something from a canvas that was empty. Jazz was not a well established genre then, but now it is. So then they had the opportunity to create and add different aspects of music, of what they want to be. Before we carry on, let's listen to the song Take a Train by Duke Ellington.
Hurry, 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 take the train to get to Sugar Hill way up in Harlem. If you should take a train, you get to where you're going in a hurry. Hurry, 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 now it's coming. Can't you hear the rails are humming? Leota, if you should miss the train, you miss the quickest way to get to Harlem.
And create a whole new thing, which is what we now know as jazz. It had to grow from different levels of what jazz should be, different levels of what music should really look like. These artists had the opportunity to create something from a canvas that was empty. Jazz was not a well established genre then, but now it is. So then they had the opportunity to create and add different aspects of music, of what they want to be. Before we carry on, let's listen to the song Take a Train by Duke Ellington. I hope you enjoyed that song. Duke Ellington was born in America in in Washington D.C. Sorry, he was born in Washington D.C. in America in 1899, and his music was mostly jazz and swing. He was a pianist, a composer, a songwriter, a band leader, an arranger, a conductor, and an actor. As an artist, he had a lot to his name. He was an artist that diversified in different things, and the instrument he played was a piano. He died in 1974 at the age of 75 after making so many accomplishments. And initially, his music had mostly attracted the African American community, but the more he crafted his art, the more he grew his skills in his music, the more he drew an audience from other races. And he had a tour that landed him in Europe, and he had a visit to England. And in England, he had a standing ovation, and that was when he became the Duke Ellington that we all know as a great artist and a great name in jazz. Not only in jazz, but in music in general. And he had such a big influence in his art that even now in our modern day times, there is a cartoon called Big Mouth, which has a character that is the ghost of Duke Ellington. And his name is thrown in a lot of songs as well. There's a song that mentions Duke. It's a song by Hosea. It's called Almost, and there's one line where he mentions Duke Ellington. It's it just goes to show how jazz did not only influence the way music was composed over the years, but it also influenced culture. It influenced how people related to each other. And in jazz's influence for culture, we speak of artists like Fela Kuti and his song Zombie. His song Zombie speaks about the liberation of African people and how African people have become zombies to their own enslavers. They've become people that are comfortable with being slaves, that they are zombies, they're puppets. We are puppets. If the West says jump, we say how high, and that's what the song Zombie insinuates. The music music in general had a lot of influence on African revolutions, and jazz in particular played a very big role in liberations of different African countries, different countries that are not in Africa but are with people of African descent, like countries in the Caribbean. And Fela Kuti is not the only example. We also have the example of people like Hugh Masekela, who were freedom fighters but also made music. And their music did not only speak about fighting for freedom, but it also spoke about how much it's going to be when the days are better, which made the difference between the artist. Fela Kuti called people out. Fela Kuti's approach was more to say, this is what you're doing, do better, do better. And then there was music from people like Hugh Masekela, where it was like, I want to be there when everything has been turned around. I want to be there when we win the battle against all these things. And Send Me is not a song that came out in the middle of apartheid from Hugh Masekela, but it was a song that came out later. But it was still a song that held the same sentiments that his music did during apartheid times when he had to go to exile. Most of these artists use their music as a platform. Jazz was a platform for people to be different and to be proudly so. The way jazz itself was created was from being different, from taking classical music and changing it to something else, from becoming different types of people simply because they got tired of the old. And it's not only tired of the old in the sense that we get tired of a song that keeps replaying, but we get tired of living a certain way as well, of living in a way where certain people are seen as more human than others. And jazz allowed a foundation for this. It allowed people to express themselves and be who they are confidently and loudly and say, this is not who we want to be. This is suffocating us. We want to break free from these ideas of what other people are putting in for us, saying people of color are supposed to be a certain way, or people of color should be separate from this. It's creating, it allowed people of color to create their own history. to create their own history in music, because not to say that Africans and Africa did not have music um, before colonialism, but the music was there. And when colonialism came in, there were certain types of music that were looked down upon, and African Americans were taken away from this music that they knew. And when they went to America, they didn't have traces of what was theirs from whatever countries they came from. So they created their own type of music, something they could identify with, something that kept them alive and moving. And jazz has the undertones of African folk music, where there's guitars, there's beating drums, there's movement, music that makes you want to move. And that's the music that these African Americans created for themselves. And it kept on growing with these new artists that allowed themselves to be a part of the story, artists that could be there and learn different things, create music that was not only what was heard from everybody else around them, but they created something completely different. Jazz has a distinct type of rhythm. Traditional jazz rhythms are known for their swinging 8 notes, where the first note is an eighth note pair and gets added emphasis on the second note. It is lighter as it swings towards the next note. Meanwhile, Latin jazz, which is built on the music of the Caribbean, does not swing, but it does involve syncopated rhythms, often pulled from Afro-Cuban traditions. Harmonic sophistication jazz music rarely uses 3 notes triads that define pop, country, and folk music. Nearly all jazz chords feature the seventh chord tone, and many include tensions like ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. Now, this is music theory for what jazz is, for how jazz was created. And this is the theoretical aspect of the creation of jazz, but for the artists that came up with jazz, it was more about expression and not theory. It was more about how they felt when they got lost in the music, how they feel when an artist is playing a jazz piece and then just gets lost in their solo. They may play the original, but to get lost in their solo of what that jazz music is supposed to sound like, of what different ways of making this music sound. And jazz allowed that expression. The history of jazz is the history of expression, the history of rebellion, the history of allowing oneself to be and get lost in art and in music. Before we carry on, let's listen to the song Molo Sisi by Mandis Diantes. And this song is by an artist who is a new artist, an artist who performs art that is jazz, but it's not jazz like the old jazz. It's the same jazz. He just is a modern day artist. So it just shows how music transcends generations. Music will outlive us. Music, like any other form of art, lives beyond a generation. It lives beyond what we human beings define as certain types.
Kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna Molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna Molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna ndithi molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wakuthetha nawe mna yabona ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona umama wabantwana bam yabona ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona umama wabantwana bam ndithi molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wakuthetha nawe mna molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wakuthetha nawe mna yabona ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona mama wabantwana bam ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona mama wabantwana bam ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona umama wabantwana bam
That was a song called Molo Sisi by Mandis Jantis, who is a South African jazz artist of this time, of modern time. And it looks like we're running out of time. So before I go, we'll speak of what the instruments that are essential for making a jazz sound. These are just instruments of the idea of what jazz should sound like. And these instruments are drums, bass, keyboard, guitar, trumpet, trombone, saxophone, and lead vocals. Once these instruments are combined, it creates a different type of jazz music. But the way jazz is, and through the history of jazz and what it shows, is that it's a genre of self-expression, a genre that allows people to be, that allows artists to get lost within their art and get lost within their music. And these are instruments that need to be present. But another thing that needs to be present for art, for jazz to be there, is expression, to allow the artist to be different things and express themselves in different ways and get lost in the music. And I am going to leave you with the song Tado by Masigo. But before I go, thank you for joining me today for this program, Art History, and listening to us talk about jazz this week. I will be back next week, same time. Stay listening to Story Club FM, and we'll bring you more on the history of art and all its different aspects. And like I always say, the earth without art is just eh. So let's talk about art.
She hit me like that. Saw that thing so beautiful. That she just hit my heart. Oh, that full force and she got me like that. I be like, baby, why you so fine? Got to make you mine. So hard to find. They be like, oh, how'd you do the thing? The way that you do it, and she ain't even show nothing. She be walking around so confident, so heaven sent. I think she was meant to knock some daylight. Like, girl, you so fine. Girl, you rockin' like sublime, super fine. She was never lying, strutting in the heels or her slides. Either way, eyes on her every single day, week, year. Everyone wondering how she does it with no fear. All that confidence, was it heaven sent? Does it come within? Does it come run out? I don't know. She'll just have them running out and in. Man, they want to sin, talking deadly sin with Mrs. Lady. I don't understand why she hit them like girl, you knock him dead. Oh, oh, oh. How you do the things you do? Baby, you knock him dead. down.